I'm Jess with NextLX, and we're building a simulation-based training program that skills candidates to spec in an AI-powered workplace simulator, or as we sometimes call it, a flight simulator for office work. But why build a flight simulator for office work? Well, that's what I'm going to hopefully convince you of today. So we believe that simulation-based training is the best way to acquire any skill. So, put differently, the best way to learn to do a thing is to do the actual thing. If you wanted, for example, if you wanted to teach someone how to hit a baseball, you wouldn't spend 30 minutes lecturing them on the physics of baseballs and how bats work, or you wouldn't have them watch 15 YouTube videos and then say, "You good?" You would actually take them out and throw baseballs to them so that they could hit it. And I'm not saying that's the only thing you would do, but you would at least do that. That is a minimum requirement, is actually have them perform the real skill. Um, and that is what simulation-based training allows you to do the real skill for the thing that you're training. So what is simulation-based training? Simulation-based is performing the skill in as close to the real world context as possible. So it's a training program that allows you to like do the thing in the real world. But it's even better than doing the thing in the real world for a couple of reasons. And here's four reasons why simulation works even better than the real world. Or you could say it is at least complementary to the real world. Um, One, simulation-based training allows for structured repetition, basically. You can try again without relying on the task coming up in the real world and without real world consequences. One of my favorite phrases is practice does not make perfect. Practice makes permanent. So how you do a thing, how you practice it is the way that you will perform it. And so you want to when you're practicing a skill, you want to perform it in as close to the real world context as possible. So doing practicing in like a classroom setting or a laboratory setting is not as effective as going into the simulation or the real world. Again, you want the simulation to be really, really close to the real world in every way that you can possibly make it, with the exception of the ability to do repetition, right? You can go back, restart the scenario, restart the scenario. The second way that simulation is better than the real world is that you can get assessments in a simulated context that are more global, that are better than you can get even in a real world context. So back to our baseball example, if you're learning how to hit a baseball in a practice session where you're hitting the baseball, you might actually put a high-speed camera on the person that's actually looking at their body motions as their body rotates and making very specific, minute adjustments to their body on each swing. You might have an expert baseball hitting coach there with you, observing you, giving you feedback as you swing. And those aren't things you could not do during the real world example, right? Like, so you have additional assessment observation skills during a simulation that allows you to learn even better. The third thing is sequencing. In a simulation, you can actually sequence the series of events that you learn so that they keep you in what's called the zone of proximal development. Basically, learning a thing has to be difficult and have a level of what's called desirable difficulty, where it pushes you, but not too far. If it pushes you too far, you give up, or it's beyond your ability to like perform the skill. And so you need to like find that Goldilocks zone that is hard enough to push you, but not so hard. And so in a simulation, we can actually scaffold the events and the things that you learn such that they're sequenced in an appropriate order where they build upon one another and they fill just the gaps that you have. We can also practice just to mastery. And once you've mastered a skill, we can go on to the next one and sequence it appropriately. And we're not relying on real world probabilities. Here's the thing about the difference between simulation and the real world is that real world things happen by happenstance all the time. And those probabilities may not actually correspond with your current gaps in knowledge. They may not correspond with like what you need to learn right now. And so they're kind of random. And in a simulator, we can actually design the sequence in which you would learn. And then the final thing about a simulator is that you can train for low probability but high risk scenarios. So in an example, we talk about this being a flight simulator for office work. And a flight simulator, pilots practice the scenario where an engine goes out in their plane. Obviously, that's an extremely critical, low probability thing. But when that thing happens, they need to be able to respond well or people die. And so there are situations that you want to train for that are extremely important to get right, but are also pretty critical. And training for those things in the real world would be both risky and expensive. And also, yeah, you can do those over and over again in a simulation. So if that's simulation-based training, how do we do job training right now? Well, I'll list four alternatives. One is YouTube. So YouTube is an incredible resource that I really appreciate, but it does not train you for a job alone. So think about how many times you've watched someone perform and explain a skill in YouTube, and yet you yourself still do not have that skill. But think about YouTube in another context. Think about the context where you're trying to fix something in your house or your car, or you're trying to build something like doing some DIY project, and you go onto YouTube or cook something. You go onto YouTube, you watch a YouTube video or two about the thing, and then you go do the real thing in the real world while you're watching the video or immediately afterwards, and think about the learning that happened in that process where you were doing it. So YouTube is actually an interesting thing, but it lacks all of you can't use YouTube alone. You need YouTube as like a supplement to a real world task performance environment. Another one would be online courses. Online courses are wonderfully sequenced and they allow for repetition, but again, practice makes permanent. So if you're doing an online course and you're doing you're not doing the real task, like let's say you're doing like worksheets or other forms of assessment that are proxies for doing the real task, then that practice is not actually like building the skill to do the real or building the ability to do the skill in the real world environment. So online courses are yeah, not great compared to simulation. And then there's like the people who talk about project-based learning. They're like, just do projects. Projects are great too, but projects, again, they may be detached from a real context, like a real environment in which you're performing it. Simulations ideally have everything about the environment that is possible to replicate in that environment. So if you think about high-end flight simulators, they actually take place inside of a replica airplane. So you're touching the actual controls. You're feeling the tilt of the plane. They're applying the G forces as you move through the turns and that kind of stuff. And that's something that's often missing with projects. Projects are often like these hermetically sealed, perfect little worlds where you're just doing this thing isolated from every real world effect. And the problem is that so much of learning actually applies on tacit knowledge, of knowledge that is in the environment and is you responding to elements of the environment. It's not just a set of propositions that you learn about how to do a thing. So anyway, projects in the context of a simulation, great. Projects on their own miss so much. And the final thing that I'll say one word about is just college as an alternative. But God help you if you're trying to go to college in order to prepare for a job. There's a reason that most graduates need additional training coming out of college to actually get ready to do a real job. I'd say that this is part of the failure of job training today in our world, is that college is not designed to help you do or perform a job or get a job even. So those are some alternatives. I hope you can see now why simulation is a much more powerful form of learning than kind of the current alternatives for job training. And so if simulation-based training is the best way to acquire skills, then we need a flight simulator for office work. And that's why we're building one. That's kind of part one of this talk of like why build a simulator for office work. Part two is talking about how our simulator actually works. How would a flight simulator for office work actually works? So you can imagine what a modern office environment looks like, especially one that has remote employees. There's a chat room. Okay, so this is where I like walk through all the different things. We show that they basically like show the environment and like demonstrate to them that, hey, this simulation is not a game. It is actually using the real tools to do real work. And so convince you that the simulation is real, show you why, and then, well, how does learning take place in this simulation? Great, glad you asked. You are assigned a project, you talk with your mentor about that project, or you talk with your manager about that project, you do the project, then you get assessment on the project, and you do that until you reach mastery, and then you do the next project in a sequenced progression until you have basically mastered all the skills. Okay, so that is project-based. That is a simulation-based training program that we've been showing you. And the really important thing is that all of this, everything I've shown you, is better, and it's not just better. It's only possible now because of AI. So we actually use AI to generate the sequence, generate the projects, to do the assessment of the projects, to do all of these things. All of the educational pieces are generated by AI. And then all of the environmental pieces are actually powered by AI. Your coworkers, your manager, your mentor, all of these are AI people in your environment that make it feel as real as working at a real job. And that really makes it close enough to the real world. And so we think now in history is a time where we can actually build simulators for training for office work when we could not do this before in a way that's efficient and scalable across any kind of office work, whether you're doing product management, project management, software development, marketing, digital marketing, customer success. Any of these jobs can now be trained in a simulation-based learning environment. And this opens up a whole new world of skills that can be trained and assessed for, and really changes the world both for job training and hiring.